Greetings, ladies and mentalgets, and welcome to this latest episode of Tales from Outer Space, where I take a space-related story from around the internet and read it out loud for your enjoyment. All the relevant links are down below. Please don't forget to do the usual YouTube gumph, because if you don't, the nanite swarms will steal your other sock. But more importantly, as always, I hope that you enjoy. I'd quickly like to thank the following Tier 5 patrons and channel members for supporting the channel: Datamagnet and Bob the Dragon. Thank you very much. The Price of Consensus, written by PodgeWrites. Log, Diplomat Heroxius Bar, Arian Consulate, Hunger of Seplius. The first time I ever truly met a human, it was in a bar on a diplomatic hub, Hunger of Seplius, a repurposed planetary engineering station in orbit around a contested star in the Maranth expanse. We'd been pounding out the terms of peace between the Maranth and the Bulrathi for over a decade at that point, and while progress was frustratingly slow, there was at least some forward momentum to the negotiations. We had just wrapped up a particularly hard-fought round of deals over the mineral access rights to the system's non-planetary resources, and was celebrating over a game of chance involving cards, chips, and a genetically engineered set of pre-sentient dice. The human, an individual by the name of Terry, had begun the game convinced that no one outside his race had ever developed the concept of bluffing, and thus had lost a sizable amount of the station script before realizing his error. Being good sports and in a charitable mood, we continued to play along into the night in order to give the poor creature a chance to make back some of his losses. He disappointed us by doing exactly that, waving his prefrontal pseudopods in exultation every time he won a hand. By the time my augmented reality overlay, which I was using in a somewhat unsporting manner to keep track of hands, told me that the human had won back his initial pot, I was starting to believe that perhaps his race had some inherent advantage at gambling after all. I was considering leaving the game before my good mood was spoiled entirely, when my AR rig began to play up. I should explain, like every other member of my species, and indeed most other sapient races, viewed reality through a lens of enhanced information and contextual feedback. In my case, this was mostly in the form of visual information, such as the current win-loss statistics hovering over each of my opponent's sense blisters, but other races had similar packages that simulated auditory or pheromonal or touch-based feedback as appropriate. While my current decision to use my own AR rig to aid my gameplay was a borderline bad form, and would have been forcibly disabled in a more formal setting, no one in close contact with alien species ever disabled the AR entirely, for obvious reasons. Thus, when my rig began to display garbled scanlines, visual artifacts, and noticeable lag, I was understandably concerned. Chancing a glance at my compatriots at the gambling table, I noticed that they also looked concerned, with the notable exception of Terry. The rest of the bar seemed to be growing agitated as well, and when my rig finally cut out, it was clear from the reaction of the rest of the room that everyone else was experiencing the same issue. There was a sudden cacophony of screams, hoots, and howls at the bar, and in an instant my eye stalks instinctively withdrew, mercifully sparing me from all but a glance at the hideous miasma of flesh, chitin, and the invariant forms of the bar that had just erupted into. After the initial uproar, the room fell more or less silent, as everyone essentially tried to hide from everyone else. The only sound was of one brave soul walking casually around the bar, possibly someone unaffected seeking to find out what was going on, and a small stream of indecipherable nonsense that seemed to be coming from the direction of Terry. When the footsteps began to approach our table, I was horrified to hear the sound of our script being cleared from the table. A sudden understanding of the situation dawned on me. We were being robbed. My outrage almost overcame my instinctual fear. I risked unfurling a single eye stalk to get a look at the thief. I immediately regretted doing so. A hideous mix of limbs, joints, and untranslatable stood before me, the product of evolution run wild in an environment that was entirely alien to the bar. The only recognizable thing in the scene was the sight of our hard-won script vanishing into a bag the thing held in the table's edge. I snapped my eye closed, and am ashamed to say that I emptied my frontal fluid sacs in the most inappropriate manner. I resigned myself to living with that theft, as well as to at least one visit to the station counselor when this was over. When I was jarred back to reality by the sound of what turned out to be Terry rising from his seat at the table. It was clear that he was agitated, even without my translation software running. The sounds he was making were nothing like those I'd heard from him just a moment before, and the final crescendo of his anger came with the sound of a bar stool shattering and splintering ceramic, and a heavy organic weight hitting the floor. Shortly thereafter, AR rigs throughout the bar began to reboot, the source of whatever interference they were experiencing having been disabled. And when my own was verifiably back on, I ran a full diagnostic twice just to be sure. I risked a look. The bar was in chaos, but it was an organized, recognizable chaos. Other patrons were slowly shuffling out, and the station's security were making their way in through the main entrance. Riot and hardened sensory baffles equipped, but apparently unnecessary. Sitting just to my left was Terry, having found a replacement for his shattered stool in the prone form of our would-be thief, now thankfully rendered in a mercifully less offensive form by the treacherous AR system. In one hand he still held his cards, in the other his drinks, while the third lay idle by his side. "Next round?" he asked nonchalantly. I must confess, it was at this point I blacked out. A few days later, after the group counseling session had concluded, I finally had a chance to speak to Terry alone. He had gone along to the session, but hadn't spoken. From his expression, it was clear he was there out of solidarity, and perhaps curiosity, rather than any real form of emotional need on his part. After most of the weeping was done, we arranged to meet later that evening in his apartment. Thankfully, he had been too tactful to suggest another bar, a venue I wasn't planning on visiting again any time in the near future. Terry lived in a small apartment roughly mid-span, which gave it a mutually comfortable apparent 0.7 G. He poured me a drink, which my AR told me was digestible, if not inebriating. This was fine by me, given my current psychological state. We spent a short while with small talk, mostly concerned with the negotiations and some minor station gossip, before I moved the conversation to the subject of my actual interest. "You know," I began, "I realize I never actually thanked you for your actions at the bar the other night. You saved us a lot of script, taking care of the hacker like that. It was rather brave-act, if I might say so." "Oh, it was nothing," he replied, waving away the compliment with one grasping implement. "I mainly wanted to ensure that we could keep playing after things calmed down." "Not much chance of that," I replied, once everyone had been exposed unfiltered. Terry nodded in agreement. "Yes, I understand that now, but at the time I wasn't quite clear on the implications." His words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and I decided to move directly to my point. "I've spoken with both station and embassy security staff about the incident. That wasn't actually the hacker you took down, but rather an accomplice. They found the hacker last night." Terry raised an eyebrow. "They did now," he said. "I'll have to chase in my embassy staff over this. No one informed me." "It's all still rather hush-hush," I explained. "The hacker was a mid-level station technician, and it looks like he co-opted station resources to achieve what he did. AR encryption is top-end, old but unhackable. He needed a sizable chunk of the station's processing core to make it happen. It's clear there must have been others involved, at least some low-level staff in reactor maintenance to cover up the increased power demand the core was pulling during the incident." I watched Terry's reaction carefully. Recently upgraded cross-species expression software in my AR scanning his every pore and micro-gesticulation and transmitting the same back to the mainframe in the Barasian embassy for examination. If the human diplomat was aware of the scrutiny, he did not show it, Yikes, Terry replied. I can see why you're keeping this low-key. If it were common knowledge that the station staff had been compromised in this way, it could pull the rug out from under the negotiations. Certainly, in the short term. I nodded in agreement. Yes, this is of concern, but not my government's primary worry. Terry looked confused, though he sat up straighter at the mention of my government, likely coming to the realization that my visit was more than just social. My AR rig informed me that there was a 95% possibility that this reaction was genuine. But then again, any diplomat would be well versed in keeping their real feelings to themselves. I pressed on. We find it unlikely that this was a simple robbery, given the effort involved. Someone with this kind of station access would have access to no end of blackmail material, as well as the ability to redirect station resources. One lost shipment of computer equipment would be more than exceeded in the earnings of a few stolen wallets and our casual gambling. I don't recall you feeling too casual about it at the time, Terry said, grinning, no doubt attempting to lighten the mood a little. I ignored the effort. I was fond of Terry, but this was government business. We're pushing for the exact details of the hack, but station security are holding back, I went on. No doubt they don't want anyone to know how badly they screwed up, Terry posited. Indeed. However, we are able to discover some details. It seems that there was a third party involved, one with access to governmentally classified details about station security protocols and AR encryption modulation. I let the unspoken accusation hang in the air for a moment. Terry stood up abruptly. Hyroxius, if you mean to make some kind of accusation, then I'd appreciate it if you came out and said so. Otherwise, I'd advise you to finish your drink and leave. Sit down, my friend, I replied. No one is accusing Earth of being involved in any way. If nothing else, your own judicious use of the bar stool is responsible for us knowing as much as we do. Somewhat mollified, Terry sat back down. My AR rig somewhat redundantly informed me that there was a 99.9% probability that his anger was genuine. I continued. We suspect that this was a field trial for AR manipulation technology by one of the negotiating parties. We've had hints of low-level attempts at gaining access to diplomatic AR rigs for months now. None successful. Until now. Okay, Terry replied, his anger subsumed by interest in what I had said. I can see how that would be an issue for you. Subtle changes in the exact details of certain agreements, manipulation of what and how things were said. Hell, we both know how much individual personalities can affect negotiations. Just making sure someone left a bad impression on their counterparts across the aisle could be devastating. Precisely, I agreed, enthused that he was so quick to grasp the scale of the issue. The applications are endless. It's precisely the reason we invest so much time and effort into ensuring the sanctity of AR systems. In fact, in the agreement our two peoples signed during our initial diplomatic integrations, an article binding both parties to share any and all encryption techniques applicable to securing augmented reality systems was given quite high precedence. I held my breath. I'd finally come to the heart of the matter. I watched Terry intently. Somewhere back in the embassy, 3 billion scripts with a quantum computer analyzed his every move. Terry burst out laughing. It was sudden and almost obnoxious noise in the small space of his apartment, and seemed to me to be at complete odds with the situation. My AR helpfully informed me that it was 99.99% certain that this display was genuine mirth. I muted the program. A moment later, when he regained control of himself, Terry finally managed to speak. Just so we're clear, he said, between bouts of chuckling. You think my government is withholding encryption research, presumably because of my behavior the other night at the bar. It is no laughing matter, Terry. You clearly were unaffected by the hack, and you alone were able to react to what was happening. I'm here to ask you what encryption protocols your AR rig is running, and for you to kindly share them with us in accordance with the treaty obligations. If some third party is attempting to manipulate negotiations, it is vital that our staff be appropriately protected. I value our friendship, Terry, but my government has to know what it is you've been holding back." Terry's bout of chuckling finally came to an end, and he spent another moment regaining the rest of his composure. "You wish to know what we've been holding back? Well, I'll be more than happy to do so, but I promise you, it's not what you think. Wait here." So saying, Terry arose and proceeded to the adjoining room. He returned almost immediately and dropped a small item of glass and plastic on the table. It took me a moment to remember that I'd muted my AR, but when I queried the system, it quickly told me the device was an ancient form of corrective optical system used by humans. Despite its redundancy, human biotechnology could correct almost any health issue that didn't outright kill them. The items remained as a piece of human fashion. In fact, I could recall having seen Terry wear them in the past, appropriately modified by my AR's interaction software, of course. "Glasses," I responded flatly, "a fashion accessory. I failed to see their relevance." Terry grinned. "Not just glasses, my friend. Those also contain a bevy of sensors, projectors, wireless network access, context-sensitive interpretive software, bone induction speakers, and processing arrays." "You are describing an AR rig, Terry." His grin widened. "Exactly," he explained. "They're my AR rig, not the ones I had at the bar, mind you. Those were fried, same as everyone else's." As if to emphasize the point, he plucked them from the table and popped them on his head. There was a moment of discontinuity as the item warped to fit around the altered physiology of my AR rig showed me. The effect was not disturbing so much as it was ridiculous, but I had grown used to it. Barian physiology was obviously somewhat larger than that of the humans. Terry held out his arms and continued grinning inanely, as if this display he had demonstrated all that needed to be said on the subject. "This is ridiculous," I replied, growing somewhat exasperated. "You were wearing these at the bar, that I concede, but what is the point of having an AR system that one can remove? What about your implants?" "Don't have any," Terry replied. "Well," he corrected, "that's not entirely true. My liver is artificial, dragged the thing to the point of surrender in college. But I assure you, I have no permanent sensory implants." He removed the glasses again, as if to underscore his point. "If this is the case," I asked, "then how exactly are we having this conversation?" "You mean how are we understanding each other?" "Among many issues, yes, that is one," I replied. "Well," he explained, "I'm speaking English, and your rig is translating, I presume." "Naturally," I replied dryly. "And you're speaking a third dialect of diplomatic Barian, correct?" I nodded in agreement. "Well," he said, "I understand that, and 2 other variants of Barian. My pronunciation would be terrible, of course. I lack your vocal cords, hence my speaking in English. But I assure you, I can understand you quite well." I blinked. Learning another language, let alone one of another species, was almost unheard of. Why would anyone bother when the universal translation was ubiquitous? "That's, I began. "Of course, I do require a translator for many of my duties. Some languages rely on sense or sounds outside the human range of hearing. But given the close relationship between your people and mine, all human diplomats learn at least one dialect of Barian. You weren't aware of this?" It just never occurred to me," I admitted, impressed. "This is almost unheard of. I'm honored, Terry, that you would take the time to learn our language." The man shrugged, as if it were nothing. "It was quite natural for us to do so. At the time of our meeting, we were inexperienced and were unaware it was even unusual. We wondered why our request for so much linguistics material were met with confusion. You kept sending complete translator apps rather than the source grammars and dictionaries." I recall the earlier meetings of our people, decades before. "We thought that you were having trouble programming your own hardware to manage our language," I explained. "But Terry, this hardly explains the other functions your AR performs in interspecies diplomacy." "You mean gesture recognition?" he asked. I admit that was harder to figure out than your language. I think I have it down now, more or less. The wavy thing you do with your tentacles to signal amusement is actually pretty hilarious to us. So that one was easy. Terry, I mean our appearance. How do you compensate for the xenophobe response without AR rigs? It was something of a taboo subject between diplomats. No one liked to be reminded that their people that they worked with on a daily basis could induce outright terror if seen without the protective filter of an augmented reality system. Oh, that, he said easily. I got over that. For those of you unfamiliar with interspecies interaction, I should explain. Millennia ago, when most species were still confined to their own system, and few, save the Maranth and the Colodile, had any interaction with other species, it was presumed by most that life, if it existed elsewhere in the universe, would more or less resemble the biosphere found on their home worlds. Aliens, when they were pictured at all, were usually imagined as anthropomorphized versions of life forms familiar to whoever or whatever was doing the imagining. Even humans did this, imagining bipedal felines, for example, or other organisms that roughly resembled themselves. Once spacefaring races began to explore and meet life forms from other worlds, however, this notion was quickly dispelled. Life had a myriad of forms it could take. Vast differences existed between what life there was from world to world, and what similarities there were served only to highlight the absolute otherness of life beyond the stars. The only thing life had in common, it seemed, was the innate disgust at, terror of, and inability to accept life from different evolutionary trees. You may find, for example, deep-sea life from your own world to be innately strange or disgusting, but ultimately that life form shares a common history with you, and in the grand scheme of things, it's practically a family member when compared to the life which has its genesis on another planet. This reaction, expressed as fear or fury, depending on one's nature, became known as the xenophobe response, and it made interactions with other species almost impossible. In the early years, this led to misunderstandings and war, often fought in ignorance of exactly what the original disagreement had been. Eventually, over time, with a great effort, translation software was created, and communication at safe distance became possible. Ironically, it was discovered that intelligent life, despite its desperate evolutionary origins, had much in common in terms of cognitive capacities, emotional requirements, and goals. Understanding each other was at least a possibility, and true diplomacy between species became possible. Eventually, AR systems, previously used by many species for entertainment, communication, education, and more, began to play a more prominent role. These systems overlaid images onto one's eyes, or whatever analog one possessed, depicting alien species in more relatable forms, usually as a somewhat altered version of one's own species. Thus, we find ourselves in the current era, having overcome our evolved shortcomings. Species from vastly different backgrounds can coexist in shared spaces. Environmental concerns accepted without voiding their untranslatable in terror, or going on a killing spree. Thus, Terry's response was as worrying as it was unbelievable. "What do you mean you got over it?" I asked, unable to keep a tone of incredulity from my voice. I wondered if Terry could even pick up on that without the translation software. Exactly what I said. Yes, it was freaky when we met you, but we got over it. Your people are giant balls of tentacles and sacks of hydrogen gas. Maranth look like a collection of skewered cockroaches. Kuril can't move without their joints sounding like someone murdered a cat. It's freaky at first, but you get used to it. Thank you for those horrifying images, Terry. Hey, your best friend is a Maranth. You think I didn't notice you both trying to hustle me the other night? He replied. My AR told me that it was only a 10% chance his anger at being genuine in this case. He was mocking me then. Yes, I am aware, intellectually speaking, that Zenith is a Maranth, I agreed, but I certainly don't need the image in my head the next time we're speaking. Terry shrugged. Or rather, I thought. Did whatever my AR system interpreted as a shrug. Meh, he said. You get used to it. I don't know what more there is to say. What's that thing making me look like? He gestured vaguely towards my eyes, but it was clear enough what he meant. You look like a slightly obese Barian male in the middle of his years, I replied. What the hell? He shot back. Tell it I'm of average weight for my age and height. My AR system told me this had only a 5% chance of being the case. I smiled. Terry smiled back, sharing the joke. Terry, if this is true, why didn't you make it clear to us? Surely I'm not the only one who isn't aware of this. Terry looked more serious now. Look, he began, it's not that we purposely hid this. You just assumed that we used the same AR rig as everyone else. And we didn't feel the need to correct you. Every species we've met that makes the same assumptions, and we don't correct them either. Our xenopsychologists posited that other races would find it strange to the point of distrust. I'm only telling you now to make it clear that we had nothing to do with the hack. I considered this for a moment. Your psychologists were correct, I said. Most species would find this strange, if it's even true, I added. Terry rolled his eyes towards heaven, or did whatever qualified at the gesture for his people. Now that he'd made me aware of it, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Terry I was seeing wasn't actually real, merely a piece of software's best guess at how he would behave if his ancestors had evolved Lbry. It was, suddenly, quite unnerving. I continued. How exactly is it that your people didn't come to develop AR? It's rather common technology, being a logical outgrowth of smaller process and portables. Are these, I gestured towards the glasses on the table, really your best people can produce? Our engineers could help you, if so. Terry sighed, but if he had taken offense to this, he gave no indication. With a certain amount of sadness in his voice, he began to speak. Oh, we developed our own AR, he explained, not long after we made our first steps into space. It began like these, he said, indicating to the glasses. But before long, it was implantable, ubiquitous. Everyone had it. We argued over rights to advertise via the devices. We argued over privacy concerns. We argued a lot, especially in those days. But we plowed ahead with AR. It was just too useful. It is exceedingly useful, I agreed. I'm unsure how you do without it. Oh, we get by. Diplomats use glasses like these. Construction workers have similar rigs. But none of us use full immersion AR anymore. And many of us point blank refuse to use even anything like these glasses. I was curious now. You say, anymore. What exactly caused the rejection of AR technology? Terry sighed again, longer and with deep sadness. It was clearly a story he didn't wish to tell, but he told me all the same. The human homeworld of Earth had, at its peak, 13 billion inhabitants. They'd been relying on AR for years in every aspect of their lives. Doctors used it to diagnose patients, mechanics used it to overlay system schematics, and everyone used it for translation and entertainment. In fact, humanity embraced the technology to a far greater degree than is common. It permeated their lives. Humanity also possessed a trait which is shared by all sapient species, but which is particularly pronounced in its people. They are political creatures. Terry made an effort to explain to me the political structure of his homeworld at this time, and failed quite badly. The fault was not in his explanation, I suspect, but in my own comprehension. He described a world overseen by a Byzantine mixture of national governments, supranational bodies, global corporations, and charismatic individuals who could sway millions, some of whom were ostensibly only entertainers. In a way, and despite the vast differences in scale, it would most readily compare to something like what the Spiral Accord had grown to become. Naturally, such an organization, confined to one planet, became difficult to maintain. Political attitudes and preferences became increasingly polarized, to the point that governance was brought to a standstill by parties which, ostensibly, all had the people's best interest at heart, but which, on principle, disagreed with every single proposal their opponents brought forward. As governments changed, successive regimes would spend much of their time in office dismantling the work of those who'd gone before, rather than building something positive of their own. This rift cut clean through society, to the point where family members, neighbors, and peers simply cut off the discussion of politics from their lives entirely. The ability to entertain an opinion variant from one's own, once seen as a hallmark of education and intellect, was abandoned. This phenomenon arose, in Terry's opinion, out of an increasing curatable communication in an age of social media which created echo chambers of discussion around the world. But he admitted this view was not universal. Regardless of the cause, the issue was compounded by augmented reality. Over time, individuals began to filter political opinion that they didn't agree with from their news feeds. However, one could still be confronted with political disagreement from family and friends. AR allowed these opinions to be, at first, censored and later altered. If a parent or sibling didn't support your party, you simply enable a feature on your AR rig which made it seem like they did. Do you believe education should be the responsibility of the national government? No problem. Your AR made it seem like everyone you knew agreed. Feel it should be a local state issue? Of course you're correct. And everyone you know agrees with you. People entered into committed relationships which, if they were aware of each other's political affiliations, would have ended in tears, if not bloodshed. For years this continued, expanded. It was widely believed to be a social good, and certainly increased social cohesion. For a time. But it was itself an unstable system. It only served to deepen actual divides, all the while disguising them. It left people completely unable to deal with any opinion contrary to their own. When AR rigs failed, as they did from time to time, individuals would literally be left at risk of mental breakdown. Others disassociated themselves from society entirely, content with the affection of the social contact their AR provided without minding at all whether the interactions that they spent their day engaging in actually involved other human beings at all. The system could not last, and indeed it did not. Unable to deal with the actual problems facing their world, specifically a wide-ranging environmental collapse their industrial systems were perpetuating, human civilization began to decay. When the weather patterns began to shift, people simply set their AR systems to show them their favorable weather. When the skies began to blacken, people simply turned on filters to make them seem more blue. When food shortages began, the AR rigs used chemical injectors to suppress appetite. As I said, the human experience of AR was far more complete than that of most species. Eventually, many humans rejected reality completely, and the society collapsed wholesale. They were left completely unable to deal with real-world problems, simply because any consensus became impossible, while apparent consensus was all anyone would expose themselves to. Those few who foresaw the disaster fled their dying world. Indeed, this is why the species is today most famous for having a home fleet rather than a home planet. And that, concluded Terry, is why we are very careful with AR these days. The idea of using an implant is anathema to us. Hell, the most prevalent conspiracy theory going is that the Spiral Accord, or the human government, or the Illuminati secretly implants us with an AR rig when we're born and subtly alters what we see. Who are the Illuminati? I asked, still processing the story of the fall of Earth. A secret society that supposedly controlled the world. Back on Earth, people used to like to think someone was in control of all the chaos. I can't see why, I replied. Your government was immense for just one world. It was, Terry agreed, almost as big as the Spiral Accord in its own way. I took a long look at Terry. Surely you're not suggesting that we are in danger of what happened on Earth. Our use of AR is far more sparing than that. Terry didn't reply immediately. Eventually, he spoke. You tell me, anything at the negotiations make you think maybe you're taking it too far? I thought for a moment. There was something, perhaps, though I was loath to admit it. The second moon of the third world in the system, it's to be handed over to the Merenth. They're going to build mining settlements there. And, Terry inquired, And while they've acceded to these demands, the Belrathi intend to mask the presence of the settlement from their citizens using an empire-wide AR update. But seriously, Terry, this is only to avoid fomenting dissent. Every time Belrathi citizens look up in the night sky, they'd see lights of the Morant settlements, reminding them of what they'd given up. That's hardly the same as sticking your head in the sand while your planet dies around you. Terry nods his head. I'll concede it's not the same scale, but it's on the same spectrum. This happens with all sorts of deals. All parties think that they've gotten what they wanted, but in reality, they're hiding something from themselves. Some goal that they couldn't achieve at the diplomacy table, but which they'd rather pretend they'd won. You become so obsessed with getting along, with reaching a consensus on the one right way to do things, that you've forgotten how to disagree. It's self-deception writ large, and it's not good for society. It wasn't good for us, and it won't be good for the rest of you either. We ended up that evening agreeing to disagree, something which I felt made an excellent counterpoint to Terry's argument. I finished my drink, and then another, before making my excuses and taking my leave. I had satisfied my initial inquiry. The humans were not holding back any technology which fell under the terms of the accord, and Terry even provided me with samples of their AR glasses to confirm the same. Before I left, however, I did wish to test something. With his permission, encouragement in fact, I disabled my AR rig. I would like to say that the experience was life-changing, inspiring, or otherwise revelatory. In fact, I took one look at the odd, unnatural biped from another tree of life entirely, and I threw up all over his floor. My AR kicked back in immediately. I offered to have the embassy staff clean his apartment floor, but Terry was a gentleman and wouldn't hear of it. I left his apartment embarrassed, but oddly elated. I didn't buy into his arguments about the dangers of AR, but I could see why he held that opinion. And more than anything else, I was pleased that, even as my mind reeled at its appearance, for the first time in 47 cycles as a diplomat, I had finally, truly met a member of another species. I had truly met a human. I resolved to start learning Anglish at that very night. Epilogue. Ambassador Terence Spinoza, Earth Diplomatic Corps, Hunger of Speples. After Heroxius had left, I called someone down to clean up his mess. Barian vomit was actually markedly less obnoxious than the human stuff, but it did tend to stain. Once the cleaning staff had departed, I poured myself another bourbon and sealed the entrance to my apartment. I flicked open the drawers to my desk and spent a few minutes turning on the plethora of privacy devices that I carried with me to every post I'd taken since leaving my home ship, a brother's quarrel some 14 years before. Satisfied that I couldn't be overheard, I made the call I'd been intending to make since the moment Heroxius revealed that our assets in the station's IT staff had been compromised. "Yes," came the voice, digitally scrubbed to prevent me from ever knowing the owner's true identity, just as my voice would be on their end. "I just overheard a meeting between two Barian ambassadors," I lied. "No point giving out identifying information. Station security has our assets in custody, and the Barian embassy means to investigate this further. Our entire AR decryption efforts stands to be uncovered." There was a moment's silence on the other end of the line. "Your orders, sir," came the voice. "As much as it pains me, we can't risk discovery. We can't save these people from themselves if they don't trust us." "Agreed," the voice said. "I presume we'll move ahead with the cleanup protocol." "I'm afraid so. I believe an accidental depressurization should do the trick. Serves the bastards right for trying to make a few bucks from petty theft by co-opting a program intended to save the entire goddamn spiral arm." The line was cut. There was no need for a response. We both knew what had to be done. I downed my bourbon and pondered pouring another. This was a setback, but we had a similar programs in place at other stations, with other approaches. A mass shutdown of the AR rigs was, in any case, a last-ditch scenario, only to be used if all other efforts to convince the Allies to reduce their reliance on the technology failed. Every year, their systems of communication and government grew, and every year, the parallels between the spiral Accord and Earth grew more apparent. Still, whatever the top brass claimed, I was quite certain that the last-ditch effort would someday be the best option available. I'd been a child when the last survivors of Earth had died, but managed to meet a few. Even after all they'd seen, most still refused to accept that they bore any personal responsibility for what had happened. I downed the last shot of bourbon directly from the bottle. Yes, it would someday be necessary. I was sure of that. History, after all, had a discouraging way of repeating itself. End of story. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you do, please consider supporting the author, even by popping over and leaving a thumbs up or a nice comment, just to show your appreciation for the story. However, if you wish to support this channel, there are links down below which will help immensely. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cheers.